Hi, so for this lesson we're going to look at consumption growth. This is part of the GDP by expenditure series of lessons, and really we're trying to answer the question, what drives consumption growth? So what kind of indicators can we look at, or what kind of things in the economy actually drive some of our decisions to consume more or less? So as we noticed from the previous lessons, private consumption plays a very large role in an economy. In the US, for example, it accounts for about 71% of GDP. In Brazil, it's about 60. In India, it's about 60 as well. In China, of course, where the growth model is very different, more directed towards private investment and much less consumption, it's about 35%. And in Saudi Arabia, it's also very low, but that's because it's such a exports account for such a large portion of their economy. So, although each economy is different, private consumption does play an important role. In some countries it's much more important than others. So we're going to take a look at certain things which help drive consumption growth in any particular country. So when you're thinking about private consumption, you're going to think at what's going to drive the consumer to spend more or less, and that could be lots of different things. So the first one is that I would talk about is unemployment. So if unemployment falls, that means more people have jobs, then you would expect people to spend more. Why? Well, they're employed and they're earning money every month. They can go out and buy dinner or presents or a car, a house, what have you. So unemployment is a pretty important one to watch. So if you're looking at indicators, you want to look at the unemployment rate, whether it's rising or whether it's falling. You also want to look at real wages, or wages in general. So are people's wages actually increasing, and are they increasing in real terms, so accounting for inflation? So if wages are not rising, then that's probably not a very good sign for future consumption. And that's largely because as the economy is growing, your share of the economy is not growing, so you can't really spend more. However, if people's wages are rising by 10–15% a year, then you could expect private consumption to rise as well. Consumer sentiment is yet another one, and this is because if consumers are, let's say, frightened or uncertain about the future, let's say there's some political risks, some elections, or because there are lots of layoffs in the economy and they're not sure whether they're going to have a job in a few months or not, or just generally if they feel the economy is going well, it can play a large role in their spending decisions. So for example, if 3 of your friends were fired recently, you'd probably maybe not want to take out a new loan to buy a car. Let's say you just probably maybe just keep that on pause, that decision to purchase that asset on pause, just because you just want to wait until your job is maybe guaranteed, or that you're not going to get fired or laid off or anything, and then you'll make that purchase, because if you do lose your job, then you have to rely on your savings, and that's why you don't want to spend so much. It could also be, for example, political risk. So let's say there's an election coming up and you don't know whether you're going to have one form of government or another, or one party or another party, and you may decide, well, if this party gets elected, they may cut taxes or something, so I'll just wait until they cut taxes to make my purchase or something. So consumer sentiment is very important, both on a positive and negative dynamic. Price levels are also important. So typically, I would say price levels are important for asset prices. So if prices are rising very quickly, then people may buy goods before they rise further. This is more related to, let's say, inflationary environments. So let's say during communism, for example, or bouts of hyperinflation in Latin America, let's say in the 80s, as soon as you would get paid, prices were rising very quickly. You go to the grocery shop, buy as much produce as you could, because in 2 days' time, that prices would have doubled. So price levels are typically important when you're thinking about consumption, especially if you're investing in them. So and I'll connect that to asset prices now. So if you think the value of a good is rising, then you might want to buy more of them because you're actually making an investment. Okay. Other things that impact your decisions to consume is monetary policy. So That's in terms of credit growth, so how much credit is being provided to the economy, but also interest rates. So if interest rates are cut by the Federal Reserve or the respective central bank in a particular economy, then it's cheaper for people to borrow because they have to pay less interest. So if they have less interest to pay, that means they may want to take on that loan. And let's say I wanted to buy a car, and my interest payments were $500, and I knew I couldn't afford that. But now interest rates have been cut. The interest payments per month are only $200. I'll be like, okay, well now I can afford that, and I'm going to buy it. So you see how cutting interest rates and increasing credit can already increase your desire or decisions to consume. Conversely, if interest rates rise very rapidly, so for example, interest rates go from 5% to 10%, you may be like, okay, well, at 10%, if I have to go to the bank and borrow money at 10%, it's just too expensive. I can't pay it back, so I won't consume. So you put off your consumption. So interest rates are very important in terms of people's decision to consume. Again, asset prices, going back to something which is related to price levels. If asset prices are rising, well, that means, so let's say I own a lot of stocks and stocks have risen 100%. I can decide to sell them or sell part of them and then have that money and spend that money. So if asset prices rise, then my total value or my net worth, or I feel wealthier because I am wealthier if I sell it. For example, if I buy a house and it increases in value and then I sell it, then I have a lot of cash. So rising asset prices are very good for consumption because you actually feel wealthier and you may sell some of your assets to stimulate that consumption. Let's say I want to sell a bit of my stock in the stock market in order to buy a new computer or a new car. So that not only do you have extra cash, but you also may feel wealthier, which actually helps your consumer sentiment. So that's good. The strength of your currency is also important. So if your currency appreciates relative to another currency, then you'll probably consume more of their goods. So let's say, or you'll consume more of your own local goods. So let's say I typically import food from another country, and I spend 10% of my money on importing food, and it so happens that it comes from a different country. Now, if my currency appreciates a lot against that country, then I don't really need to use 10% of my income to buy the same amount of goods from that country because my currency is valued at a higher level. So I actually need a little bit less money. So what happens with the extra money? Well, I can buy more goods from abroad, right, with the extra savings, or I could buy more goods domestically. So the strength of your currency doesn't always have a huge impact, but it can have an impact on private consumption in a particular country. Fiscal policy is also another thing that one should look at when thinking about what drives consumption. So fiscal policy is essentially government's taxing and spending, and if the government has or pursues expansionary fiscal policy, so either by giving jobs to people or providing subsidies or wealth transfers, then this can stimulate consumption. So for example, unemployment benefits are a form of subsidies which provide people with the ability to consume more. So fiscal policy in terms of the government spending, either by creating jobs, putting money in your pockets, or give you subsidies of some form, can affect consumption quite a bit. But also the other side of fiscal policy is taxes. So if my taxes fall, let's say I pay 50% tax, which I don't, and then it falls to 5%, then I have 45% of my income to play with. So I may decide to save some, but I also may decide to consume more. So if a government increases or decreases taxes, then that can also affect how much disposable income you have in order to consume. So if they increase taxes a lot, then you'll consume less. If they decrease taxes, you'll probably save a little bit, but you'll also spend more. When looking at understanding private consumption and trying to understand whether private consumption will grow in the future or not, I think one thing which is important to look at is debt levels. So, for example, if you have very low levels of debt, then you may go to the bank and say, look, I want to borrow some money because I want to buy some goods, I want to buy a car, I want to buy a house, or I want to buy a rug or what have you. And the bank will probably give you, as long as you have a job, they'll probably give you the loan so then you can buy that good. But if you already have a lot of debt, right? So if I've been taking loans for many years and I have a lot of debt, then two things may happen. First of all, the bank may say, well, you already have a lot of debt. We don't want to extend you more debt because you already have a lot and you might risk not paying it back. So, they may not want to lend me more debt, which means I can't actually consume that good I wanted to. And second of all, I may also decide, like, actually I have quite a lot of debt, so I don't want to consume more. So individuals' indebtedness can affect their future consumption as well, because if you have a lot of debt to pay back, you may have to save in order to pay back your debt rather than consume more. So debt levels are very important, and on an aggregate level for an economy, debt levels are important. And last, but of course not least, these are just some of the largest themes which I think are important, your savings rate. So if you save a lot, then you're probably spending less. If you save very little, then you're spending a lot, or you're spending more. So the saving rate in a particular economy also helps determine what future consumption is going to be. So for example, if by some historical, let's say on a historical level, people typically save 20% of their income, okay? So they've been saving 20% of their income for the past 50 years, generally, in an economy. Now, let's say some one-off event makes the saving rate rise to 25–30%. Well, that's going to hurt consumption in the short term because you're saving more. But then if someone expects people to return to their normal saving habits of about 20% of their income, then they can expect consumption to rise going forward because their saving rate is currently 30% and expected to fall to 20%, which means their spending rate will increase. So spending rates and saving rates can also determine how much consumption you have. So these are the main dynamics that I would look at private consumption in a particular economy. Of course, there are other things as well, but I think these are the most important. And if anyone were to look at what's going to drive private consumption in the next year or 2 years, these are the type of things I would look at. But really, what are the trends? So what are the trends in unemployment? What are the trends in your wage growth? What are your trends in consumer sentiment? Are interest rates falling or are they increasing? Are stock prices rising? Are house prices rising, which make you feel wealthier? Is the government engaging in expansionary fiscal policy to help stimulate consumption? Is it cutting taxes for consumers in order for them to consume more? Can consumers actually consume more, or can they take on more debt, or do they have to pay back their debts, etc.? So just in general, these are the things I look at when looking at consumption growth.